Alex, I guess just to start off with, obviously most people know who you are as far as Startup Aus, one of the big proponents for advocacy for startups for a long time within Australia. And you've watched this whole thing grow, over the past 5, 6+ years, in particular since the Crossroads reports were coming out. And really from in the halls of Canberra to from a policy perspective, from seeing different things grow. What I'd love to hear from you is, especially after 2020, where we are now, what do you see as, I guess, the state of the overall Australian startup ecosystem, particularly over the past 12 months? What do you see is worked? What do you see as some of the challenges? And what are some of the things that maybe we can stop and keep going?
Yeah, I mean, since I've been really in Australia advocating for startups, which is about 5 years, the ecosystem has grown exponentially, like really the right kind of hockey stick growth that you want to see from high growth tech companies. And that's the ecosystem as a whole has been growing like that. So that is a really good sign over the last, half decade that we're on the right track. I was actually speaking to an investor earlier today who was talking about how he thinks Australia might have actually outperformed Israel over the last 20 years, with most of that growth actually having been in the last few years, with some really big returning companies, Atlassian, Canva, these kind of companies really, really returning lots of capital to investors and making a big dent in the world. So that's been the story of the last half decade. I think the last year has been anyone's guess really in terms of the total impact across the economy. Lots of sectors completely decimated. Thankfully, tech isn't really one of those. I think we've had, a mix of success stories in tech and other companies that have been hard hit by COVID. But there aren't, lots of other sectors don't have success stories coming out of it. So, lots of digital products have seen an uptick in users, and those companies have really benefited. So, I'd rather be in a success in a mixed industry than one where there was really just a negative impact from the virus. And I think the really exciting thing looking just slightly ahead for the sector is actually just that we're in a great position now as a country, with a fair bit of venture capital sitting as dry powder with the VC firms and with lots of really talented entrepreneurs. We're in quite a good position to build the kinds of companies that we'll need to see in the post-COVID environment for the economy to really rebound really rapidly. There'll be lots of new opportunities coming in a time where the global economy is shifting pretty quickly, and hopefully we can, we're in a position to take advantage of some of those new opportunities.
Thanks for that, Alex. And it's obviously really encouraging as we look to other countries for you to say, compared to, relative to Israel and maybe some of the other ones, we're doing really well. And you mentioned things like Atlassian and Canva. If we can just reflect back a little bit more on the past, if you think about some of the things that maybe haven't worked, some of the things that have been a bit of a challenge that we can learn from, because obviously in the startup world, we want to learn from the past to not treat it as failure, but say, well, how do we not replicate that? What are some of the things that maybe haven't served us well over the last, say, 3 to 5 years?
Look, I'd probably go to three specific things that we could probably do better, or that we have started to improve. The first one, which was the most obvious deficit in the system, 5 years ago, was that there wasn't a lot of capital around for Australian entrepreneurs. We were losing a lot of entrepreneurial talent to Silicon Valley. The thesis was, if you wanted to raise a round of $10 million or more, you basically needed to do it somewhere else, and probably on the West Coast of the US. Now that has changed dramatically in the last few years. We've sort of been doubling the amount of VC funds held by Australian VC firms every year for 5 years. And now it's up to kind of $2 billion raised last calendar year by Australian venture firms, and something like $4 billion in dry powder. And we saw Blackbird this year raise a $500 million fund right in the middle of COVID. So that hasn't slowed down even a little bit. And it's gone from being a real weakness of the system to being a real strength of Australia's startup ecosystem. So that's check for the first point. The second point, which I think we haven't quite solved as comprehensively, is talent. So any really fast growing sector needs a really big uplift in the number of people who have got the right skills to support the growth of those companies. And I always say that, what we really demand of our startups is that they're globally relevant. We want companies that can hit a global market and be competitive with global competitors. And they won't be able to do that unless they've got the best talent in the world to deliver that. So something we've been trying to do a lot of in the last few years is really amplify Australia's ability to attract the best tech talent in the world, to get the settings in place to allow them to come here, and then also to help grow some of Australia's talent from the grassroots up through education and on-the-job skills training. And I think that's still a work in progress. We still see quite a big deficit in terms of the demand for talent in the tech ecosystem here, and the supply of talent. There's still a lot more demand than there is supply, and there's a lot of great jobs going in technology in Australia. I think the third thing that we probably need to work on culturally is sort of ambition of Australian founders. You hear this a lot from American investors in particular, where they talk about founders in the US really trying to change the world from day one. I think Australian founders, probably born in an era where there wasn't a lot of freely available venture capital, have often got a narrower view. They've got a local market view first, or they've got a lower level of ambition in that early stage of their startups. And I think that needs to change if we want to really compete with the very biggest companies and the very fastest growing ecosystems in the world. It's gradually changing, and it's gradually changing partly as a result of those other factors which we're working on. But we can do more work there still.
Yeah, that culture is a huge one, at least to where I want to take the question next is, we're speaking directly to people on the ground supporting entrepreneurs, startups, innovation-driven enterprises to do something new. As we think about those three things that maybe have been a bit of a challenge, and we see some slight shifts going through, so we have some encouragement. When we look ahead, say the next 2 to 3 years, what would be your guidance for people that are on the ground at the local government level, at the state government level, the incubators, the accelerators, the economic development practitioners, these people that have vested interest, this ecosystem saying, well, so what do we do next? We get it, we need talent. It's great that the dry powder is sitting there. We know we need to change culture. Alex, what do we do?
Yeah, well, one of the really encouraging things is that I think, of the players in government around the country, actually the local and state governments are the ones that probably get it the most. We've seen significant investment at a grassroots level from state governments in certainly right down the East Coast and in South Australia. We've got innovation precincts springing up in all of those major cities, often at a global scale. That will help sort of put a bright light on the sector, provide a kind of lighthouse moment for investors and customers to understand where technology products are being built in Australia. And so that's, that sort of state and local government investment in place is really important. We also see, quite a lot of support measures around, as you say, those ecosystem support structures like incubators and accelerators, really important. And actually at the moment, really under threat because, those are often real estate dependent businesses where companies are coming to work from. Co-working spaces and incubators and accelerators are often some of the hardest hit at the moment by the pandemic. And so we've seen state governments in lots of cases step in to support those businesses through a pretty tough time. But they'll be really important to make sure that we've got enough of those support infrastructure players in the system to help not make sure that this wave of companies over the last 5 years doesn't end up as a golden generation, but actually it's just the first part of a really strong pipeline of high value companies being created.
Yeah, and that is really a good point. It's like, just because we have Atlassian and Canva, we can't stop now. Like this really is a long play. Like we're seeing the fruits now of what started maybe in a co-working space, maybe at some hackathon 5 to 8 years ago. So
yeah, that's exactly right. And I think if we rest on our laurels by, saying, okay, well, we've solved this, we've got a few big unicorns and obviously we can stop there. That won't be enough. There is a huge opportunity available for economies around the world with the development of technology. Frankly, we'll need to grab a big part of that pie to offset, some of the other bits of the economy which are likely to fade, particularly in an era where resources, fossil fuels and resources are likely to diminish in terms of global economic impact. And so, we want to keep building that pipeline, that engine for growth for the economy in new areas, new industries, and particularly in digital and technology. I think it's really critical for Australia's economic future, and we haven't done it yet, even though we've done a good job so far.
Yeah, and like we talked about the local level as far as helping to support, people on the ground, make sure they have that entrepreneur support infrastructure. Bringing it all together, we've seen specialization in specific areas from, aerospace down in South Australia, agriculture in Queensland, med tech down in Melbourne. We're seeing, obviously resources over in WA. What about bringing it all together at a national narrative? Like what brings Australia and says this is Australian entrepreneurship? I know it's something with Startup Aus that you've been, passionate about for the last several years. How do we do that better?
Yeah, I think the thing you just described is mostly organic and partly constructed, and that is specialization by region. And as you say, is a really strong kind of defense and space focus in South Australia. I think New South Wales would lay claim to a kind of fintech focus with some really big fintech businesses here. And lots of other parts of the country are trying to also develop those specializations. I think that's a great idea. I think you can't push it too hard because you've got to also build on the blocks of, successful companies in those spaces. And the other thing is that, in lots of ways, these are jurisdictions that are in competition for talent. They're in competition for the best companies. And so getting coordinated cooperation is actually pretty difficult. I think if we, at a national level, are describing a narrative, we've got to make sure that we're holistic about describing that narrative in terms of the kinds of companies that have succeeded, the kinds of businesses that they're pursuing, and the kinds of founders that they are. And then you've got a kind of cohesive cross-sectional narrative to tell a story to an international audience. I think it's important from a domestic perspective that we have, strong, vibrant competition about who goes where and who can build a faster growing startup ecosystem. I think that's exactly the kind of thing that we need to help generate that kind of activity. But when we're selling Australia internationally, we absolutely can't have competition between, Adelaide and Sydney or wherever it is, because otherwise, international companies looking for a home to do their next R&D project, for example, will go to Singapore instead. So we really must tell a good story about Australian technology, Australian entrepreneurship, and the ability to build great companies from an Australian base.
Yeah, I really like what you said there as far as like definitely fostering that local narrative, that local strength of capability, but then rolling all that together at a national narrative to say this is Australia, and actually it's the diversity that it's the strength that could attract people here. Yeah.
Exactly right. And actually those specializations have flow over effects as well. I mean, you just have to look at London, which specialized in fintech. I think 7 or 8 years ago, David Cameron, who was the Prime Minister at the time in the UK, said, we want to make London the best place in the world to build a fintech company. And they set about doing that by a lot of different mechanisms that the government coordinated, and it was successful. London became the best place in the world to build a fintech. Lots of people came into London to start and join fintechs. And then, because London's a financial hub, but then there were some great tech companies growing up in London as well, not necessarily in fintech, but with lots of talent around to help boost the growth. And so it does have spillover effects that are really beneficial for non-specialized companies within a specialized ecosystem.
Yeah, excellent. So just to wrap up then, reflecting on kind of where you've been and what you've seen and some of the chat we've had and where you see things going, if you had like one message to people that are actually still on the ground supporting entrepreneurs, ecosystem builders, from government agencies to hubs and programs and schools and universities, researchers, all focused on helping other people give it a go, what would be your recommendation for the next 12 months?
Stick with it, I think. Resilience is one of the most important qualities of anyone in entrepreneurship, and that now goes for anyone supporting entrepreneurs as well. It's a tough time at the moment to be in the support infrastructure for any business sector, also for startups and entrepreneurship, but it's a critical time to stick it out. And I think, honestly, for Australian entrepreneurship, the best is very much yet to come. So, there's a real uptick likely to be there in the near future on the other side of this, and we'll need all the support structures in place that we can get to make that as successful as possible.
Excellent, Alex. Appreciate your time.
Thanks, Chad. It's been great chatting.